and orchards. After they had sung it over and over again until Compassionate knew it by heart, Grace and Glory set about preparing a little midday meal for them both. And as she did so, the two talked together about many things. Grace and Glory promised that she would visit her cousin every day, and Compassionate accepted the offer with overflowing joy and gratitude. As it turned out, there was a special reason for this. Grace and Glory, she said, speaking slowly but and rather hesitatingly, but with great earnestness, if you are willing, I would like you to help me with something. With all my heart, answered Grace and Glory gladly, in any way that I can. There is nothing that I should like more. Then went on Compassionate with a little flush on her cheeks. I will tell you what I have been thinking and hoping. You know that my husband is coming out of prison in a few days' time, and I am waiting to receive him, for poor and miserable as this attic is, and terribly close to temptation as, alas, it also is, it is the only refuge which he has in all the world. I shall be here to do all that I can for him. And as she spoke, her face flushed with tender love, and she seemed to have forgotten completely how weak she was and how utterly unfit to do anything. But she went on looking at her cousin entreatingly. But dear Grace and Glory, my brother Craven fears to leave prison on the same day as my husband, and he has nowhere to go. I have no room for him in this tiny attic. Neither would Mrs. Murmuring allow him to come here. They will take my poor husband back to be their drudge, but not Craven. I know, dear Grace and Glory, how much you have suffered at the hands of my brother, and how you have never been able to bear him. But oh, I cannot bear to think of his coming out of prison with no one to meet him or to speak a gentle, loving word to him, and with nowhere to go, and made to feel that no one in the wide world will have anything to do with him. My mother and Gloomy are not here to take him home, and the cottage is shut up. The shepherd himself chose to take them away just at this time, so it must be right. And much as I long to go to meet him, I am still unable to leave the attic. Dearest Grace and Glory, you are our nearest relative. Would you feel able and willing to go to the prison to meet them both? And could you perhaps arrange with Mrs. Valiant or one of the shepherd's other friends to let poor Craven have a room until he can find work and feels ready to face the world again? She broke off, trembling and sobbing, and instantly Grace and Glory was kneeling beside her with a radiant face and saying, "Oh, Compassionate, what a lovely thought that is. You don't know how I have longed to be able to do something for poor Craven. Almost uh, uh, more than anyone else. I have received so much, and he is so utterly destitute and miserable. Of course, I will go with all my heart. I will go to welcome them both. Craven is your brother and my cousin and my closest relative. But oh, Compassionate, do you know the thought that came to me while you were speaking? It really is too lovely for words. I'm sure it came straight from the shepherd himself." And she laughed joyfully as she spoke. "What was it?" asked Compassionate eagerly, and with hope dawning in her eyes. "Why, it came to me that there is your mother's courage standing empty and all ready to be used. You don't want your husband to come here to this attic in the inn, where he will have to encounter such temptation every time he comes and goes, and where he never be out of reach of his worst enemy, drink. But see, I will take joy and peace, and we will go and spring clean your mother's cottage from top to from top to bottom and make it all ready. And oh, compassionate, you can leave this attic right away. The song is beginning to come true at once, and you and Moody and Craven can all live there together. I will come along every day, and the other friends of the shepherd will help. I know, and I will help you with the meals and the work, and you three can be together in your own home. Oh, compassionate, you will certainly get better ever so much more quickly as soon as you get out of this oven like attic, and your husband will be away from temptation. A flush of lovely color had flooded into Compassionate's cheeks, and her eyes began to shine like stars at the very mention of such a plan, but she hesitated fully. Oh, grace and glory, it sounds too lovely, almost like the high places themselves, to think of being home again and out of this place of terrible temptation. But how shall we manage? We must earn something, you know, and this is the only work we can do. Poor Moody and I do the mending for Murmuring, and he will do all the rough jobs about the premises. She sighed heavily as she spoke, and the color faded again from her cheeks. Murmuring will never let us leave as long as she can get work out of us for almost nothing. No, no, exclaimed Grace and Glory. You can never be meant to stay here, just existing in penury and at the expense of poor Moody's safety. No, never. We will ask the shepherd and his friends. There must be some way in which you can support yourselves and Craven too without being dependent on the shepherd's enemies. I believe too that bitterness will be willing to help you move indeed, to help in any way he can in order to make some sort of atonement to you, for he is utterly wretched over the misery and suffering you have undergone since you came to live and work here. Leave it to me, compassionate. We won't say a word to Murmuring, but I will speak to Bitterness and enlist his aid. Meanwhile, I will get dear Mrs. Valiant and Mercy to help me prepare the cottage for you. Indeed, we won't waste a moment. Did your mother leave the key with you? Yes, that's good. Let me have it, and we will set to work at once. And you, meantime, as you are able, can begin gathering together your things and packing what you need to take with you. Oh, cousin, I am so happy I feel as though I can't contain the joy, but must burst with it to think of it. A home for you and your husband, and for my cousin Craven. I can help to make it ready and can go and meet them and bring them to it. Could anything be lovelier? The two women kissed each other with inexpressible joy and thanksgiving, and then Grace and Glory sped on her way, first to the home of Mrs. Valiant, then to Mercy, then to the deserted cottage of the widow. Dismal forebodings, such a transformation from the three women and their friends worked in the cottage and in the garden overgrown with weeds, as can scarcely be imagined. Fearless Trust, one of the shepherds who was courting Mercy and some of his friends, dug up the garden, burned the weeds, planted the beds with vegetables and flowers, and painted the cottage. The women scoured and cleaned the rooms, sewed curtains, washed linen, repaired and arranged the furnishings, and joyfully contributed from their own stores the articles needed to restock the linen and china cupboards and to beautify the rooms. Within a week, it was the neatest, fairest, coziest cottage in the village, and the cupboards were stocked with supplies, loaves and pies and jellies, and fruits and vegetables, and a host of other good things. Mrs. Valiant had brought over some fowls, and her future son in law had built a fine run and chicken coop. Then Compassionate was taken to the cottage and installed there with great rejoicings, and everything was ready for the reception of her husband and brother the following day. Her closest friends gathered round her that evening. She looked a different woman already in her great joy at escaping from the miserable attic and having a home of her own. As she sat in the porch with her cousin Grace and Glory and her friends, Mrs. Valiant, Mercy, and Fearless Trust, they talked over their plans and hopes, yes, and still more their fears for the morrow, for fears there were. They went over every point again and again and tried to comfort one another. But would it be possible? They asked one another to persuade the two men to return to the village where their shame and disgrace were known to everybody. What would they say when they found themselves surrounded by the shepherd's friends? How could they be warned? How could they be weaned away from their old associates, above all, from the tormenting slavery of drink? It was one thing to prepare and make ready for their return with all the joy of love, but how could the two men be persuaded to enter into and accept the things which love had prepared for them? Suppose they refused to come, as now seemed all too possible. Suppose they had made other plans while in prison and meant to make off and hide themselves among the teeming multitudes in the city of destruction, and so be lost beyond recovery. Compassionate and grace and glory shivered at the bare possibility of such a thing. Fearless trust bit his lips and moved restlessly, and even Mrs. Valiant seemed to have nothing definite to suggest. Then there was the problem also as to who should go to meet them. If Grace and Glory went alone, they might ignore her and just march off and leave her, whereas if too many went, and of course all of them were the shepherd's friends, whom the two men had always despised and disliked, either they might be frightened away or else made hopelessly self conscious and more determined than ever to go to their own way. Oh, if only the Oh, if only the shepherd were there to tell them what to do in the midst of their perplexity and doubt and longing. They looked up there, they looked up, and there he was standing beside them with inexpressible joy and thankfulness. They welcomed him and told him the whole situation. What were they to do? How could they win these weak and miserable men, upon whom all their hearts were now set with compassionate longing and love? As soon as they had finished pouring out all their doubts and fears, the shepherd said quietly, Grace and Glory is to go to the prison because she is their nearest relative. Mrs. Valiant shall go with her also because she is motherly and understanding and unsentimental, and she will neither sob or bemoan them. Then he added, and my friend, bitterness will drive you both over to the prison in his car and bring you all back here to the cottage. There was a moment of almost stupefied silence following these last words, and then Mrs. Valiant said in a tone of quite indescribable satisfaction, Your friend Bitterness, aha, so at last you have won him. Bitterness has decided to give up the public house business altogether, said the shepherd, and to take service with me. We have not yet persuaded his wife, murmuring to do the same thing, and at present she is going to continue to run the business as her own concern. Meanwhile, Bitterness feels that on him lies a great part of the blame for the disgrace and shame into which Moody and Craven have fallen, and he is anxious to make all amends possible and to help them. At this stage, I believe he is just the man to be able to persuade them both to come home to the village. And so it was settled. Early next morning, Bitterness arrived at the cottage with Mrs. Valiant, Grace and Glory and Mercy, who was to help Compassionate with all her loving plans and contrivances for welcoming home the prodigals. After leaving her at the cottage, the others drove off to the prison. Thus it came to pass that when Craven, Fear, and Moody found the great prison gates at last opened to let them out, and were preparing to slink away and lose themselves in the labyrinth of city streets as soon as possible, they found the chosen three waiting to meet them. Mrs. Valiant, with her beaming, motherly face, grace and glory, and the tall, burly figure of Bitterness, the proprietor of the inn, in much trembling. Bitterness stepped forward first, and seizing Moody's hand in his, said in a voice of gruff kindness, tinged with sincere shame, Moody, my dear fellow, I'm thankful to see you again. I blame myself almost entirely for all that has happened, and beg you to let me make any amends in my power and to help you now in every way I can. At the same moment, Grace and Glory stepped quietly up to Craven, Fear, and placing her hands on his shoulders, kissed him gently on both cheeks, but found herself unable to utter a single word. Good Mrs. Valiant, however, bustled forward and was so cheery and matter of fact as though she were merely greeting and welcoming them home from a journey, that the two men found it impossible to be stubborn and resistant, and before they quite knew what was happening, Moody was seated on the front seat of the car beside Bitterness, and Craven Fear was wedged in between his cousin and Mrs. Valiant on the back seat. That remarkable lady was soon chatting away cheerfully, telling them all the news of the village, not waiting for any remarks or answers which she knew quite well would not be forthcoming. So they came to the cottage and to the little homely feast which Mercy had prepared for them, and to the gentle, loving welcome of Compassionate, who received her husband and brother as though they were in very truth the joy and satisfaction of her heart. Undoubtedly, it was the presence of Bitterness, the once domineering man, who was now so changed and humble, which made the return possible and prevented the two men from bolting from the cottage and the village as soon as the meal was over. There was something so sincere and touching in his obvious remorse and desire to make amends, and in the way in which he he took his place alongside them, sharing the blame and disgrace and planning with them how all three of them could start afresh, that in the end they could not resist him, and both finally agreed to stay for some days at least, albeit with apparent sullenness and unwillingness. If any other influence had worked upon Craven Fear, he gave no sign of it, but only sat in stubborn silence, whether surly or ashamed it was hard to say. Every now and then, however, he raised his eyes furtively, and looked around the transformed room, at the gentle light shining in the eyes of his sister as he sat beside her husband, at the handsome, pleading face of the repentant Bitterness, at the kind face of Mercy as she deftly served them, and once and again, almost covertly, at his cousin, who sat nearly as silent as himself on the other side of the table, the girl who had once been ugly and crippled, whom he had tormented again and again since she was a tiny child, and who in the end ran away to escape marrying him. Now here she was sitting with him in the cottage, which was so completely transformed he hardly recognized it as the same dreary place where they had all lived together, and she too was incredibly transformed. Only once did she say anything that evening, and that was after Bitterness had told them of his plans for starting anew in business, and had pleaded with them both to stay and work with him. Craven Fear, looking covertly across the table, saw that his cousin's eyes were filled with tears and that they were turned upon him, and he heard her whisper, "Oh, Craven, you will stay, won't you?" He made no answer, but sat with his great oversized body slouched in the chair, looking as though wild horses would not drag a word out of his lips, but he stayed later that night in the room familiar since childhood, now so lovingly rearranged and in such great contrast to the prison cell which had housed him for so many months. With none to see or hear, the great hulking man laid himself face down on the bed and sobbed like a little child. A few days later, the shepherd, sitting at midday among his sheep in the shade of some great trees, looked up and saw the huge slouching figure of Craven Fear coming across the fields toward him. Never before had this man approached the shepherd of his own free will, but now he came hesitatingly, it is true, but with a certain dogged determination toward the one from whom many a time he had fled, the one who in the end had been the cause of his imprisonment. The shepherd sat quietly, looking steadily at him as he stumbled forward, his eyes downcast, his face and hands twitching nervously. Finally, he stood before the one he had never dared to look in the face. Then he bent his huge form and knelt in the dust in silence, never spoke a word. At last, Craven lifted his eyes and blurted out, "Sir, if you will, you can make me different." "I will indeed," said the shepherd in a strong, clear voice. "Your name now is Craven Fear, but you shall be called Fearless Witness, and you shall be my messenger and suffer many things for my sake." When Craven Fear left the place under the trees where he had entered the shepherd's service, he went straight back to the cottage and sought out his brother in law. He found him in the little backyard, drearily chopping wood. "Moody," said Craven Fear, going up to him. "Come with me." "Where to?" asked Moody, looking at him as though he were a ghost. "To the shepherd," said Craven Fear simply. "He can do everything for you that needs doing." "The shepherd," gasped Moody, and cringed away backward. "What do you mean, Craven? I shan't go to him." "Why, the first thing that he would say is that I must give up the drink, and I can't. I can't live without the stuff, and what's more, I can't stand this life in the cottage without it any longer." "That's just what I mean," said Craven. "You can't manage without him any longer, and neither can I. Come with me. I'll take you straight to him. I know where moment. He won't be able to do anything for me," wailed Moody miserably, cringing further away from his brother. "It's no good my listening to you, Craven. You are stronger and he may be able to help you, but I am too weak for him to be able to do anything with." "Well, you don't need to listen to me," said Craven patiently but doggedly. "Just come and see him for yourself and hear what he says about it." And with that, he put out one of his huge hands and laid it firmly on the shoulder of his trembling brother in law. It was one thing for Craven to say, "You don't need to listen to me," but quite another thing for Moody to avoid doing so, for Craven was almost a giant, head and shoulders taller than most of the men in the valley, and possessed of great strength, which he had been accustomed to exert to utmost during his bouts of bullying. Now, when for the first time he was engaged on a really good job, he had no idea at all of employing less strength and effort, so that the shrinking Moody found himself propelled forward quite irresistibly by the heavy and powerful arm of his brother in law. Off he had to go, whether he wished or no, for there was no escaping that powerful brotherly arm. Thus it came about that a little later the shepherd beheld the figure of the man he had just taken into his service, who was later to become known far and wide as Fearless Witness, him pushing toward him the shrinking figure of the timid Moody. And if at the sight there was something very like a smile on the shepherd's lips, there was also upon his face a look of indescribable joy and satisfaction. Moody, looking up at last and catching sight of that expression, suddenly stopped trembling and resisting and stepped forward of his own free will. Sir, said Craven, fear planting the little man before the shepherd and keeping his huge arm around the bowed shoulders. Sir, I have brought my brother to you. He is not nearly so bad a man as I am, but he too needs your help and power. Moody again raised his eyes toward the face which was turned to him, and meeting the understanding and compassionate look of the shepherd, blurted out in a faint, trembling voice, Sir, I am the slave of an unclean spirit. Can you cast it out and deliver me? Most certainly, said the shepherd, and he laid his hands on him and said, I make you free, and when the Son makes you free, you are free indeed. Amen. That was a well done chapter to read in this book. I'm glad that Jesus Christ casts out those kind of evil spirits that work for the devil. And God bless all of you believers, and may chapter 13 of Mountain of Spices be a blessing and minister unto all of you. In Jesus' name, amen.